Welcome everybody at Brainwash Festival, 8 episodes of Islamophobia. Very nice to have you all here at Sunday afternoon. My name is Hanna, I'm a freelance journalist, and today I'm the moderator of this panel discussion. We're gonna talk about the boundary between activism and journalism. And we're also gonna touch upon institutional racism and the power of institutions. We will do this with Clarice Gargard on my left and Hamza Syed on the Zoom. He's all the way from New York. He woke up very early today to be with us. Thank you for having you. Maybe you could introduce yourselves to the people that don't know you yet. Shall we start with you, Clarice?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Clarice Gargard. I'm a journalist, writer, filmmaker, organizer. I think I'm gonna keep it short. That's what I am.
Yeah, a lot of things. And you're one of the most important voices in the discussion here in the Netherlands about these topics. So they say, you'll get that from me. Hamza, could you also introduce yourself to the people that don't know you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Hamza Syed. I'm an investigative reporter and a podcaster. And I'm the host of a podcast series that came out through the New York Times called the Trojan Horse Affair. And up to date, it remains my only professional credit as a journalist, so I will be able to keep this one short. Yeah,
the Trojan Horse Affair. Before we talk more about that, who of you people in the audience have actually listened to the Trojan Horse Affair? Maybe you can put on your hand. Okay, so not everybody has listened to it yet. Hamza, could you explain to us what the Trojan Horse Affair was and when you made it and for what platform?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, to those who haven't listened, get out of this room. I'm kidding. What are you doing here? No, I'm kidding. Yeah, get out. The Trojan Horse Affair, it's a story that focuses, it's a bizarre story that focuses on this anonymous letter that surfaced in my city in Birmingham, England, back in 2014. And this letter was intercepted by the authorities, or at least that's kind of how it presented itself, and appeared to be a manuscript of a secretive Muslim plot to take over schools in the city, and possibly with an eye to radicalizing students. And according to this intercepted communication, it seemed as if this plot had been going on for a while, and the author, whoever they were trying to franchise it into a different part of Britain. And the authorities responded to this in full force. There was 4 national inquiries that were launched. The head of counterterrorism in Britain came to investigate this letter and the schools where it alleged this plot was happening. But all the while, it was never really clear what evidence this was all based on. And the author of that anonymous letter that tipped the authorities off to this alleged plot was never discovered. And so my series looks back at that case and asks essentially that one question, which a lot of people overlooked, which was who wrote that letter, who wrote Operation Trojan Horse, and to see if the discovery of who authored that letter and their motivations was going to change Britain's understanding of what happened to the Trojan Horse.
Yeah, so basically the entire Muslim community of Britain got like backlash without a pinch of evidence based on an anonymous letter. Why did nobody try to figure out who the author was?
I mean, that's my question. That's the question I took all the way to the New York Times eventually. I don't know, honestly. I can speculate and...
We know.
I imagine it has a lot to do with people don't generally go looking for, to answer questions that they think they already know the answer to. And I think this letter spoke to many prejudices that exist in Britain about Muslims. And I just don't think people needed verification of that fact. That's something that they understood before they turned up to Birmingham to investigate.
Yeah. And what made you tell this story? Why did you find it this important?
Honestly, because no one else was telling it. I didn't want to be a journalist. That wasn't a plan. I was a doctor and a TV writer for a little bit, and I had my own thing going on. But I think there's a point, and I imagine this is true for a lot of people sat there in the audience. There's a point to which you draw your own civic line, and for me, when Muslims in Birmingham started being accused and had their careers destroyed by anonymous letters that nobody decided to verify. At that point, the situation was so close to home that I don't think I could justify being just on the sidelines watching this. So that's kind of what motivated my journey into journalism, to try to affect this in some way, because I thought personally a line had been crossed that I couldn't ignore.
Yeah, and what would you say your role was in making this podcast? Because I've seen it develop, by the episode.
I think my role continues to be defined by the industry since the podcast has come out, so it keeps going. I was a student journalist. This was my student project, and the podcast begins essentially the night before my journalism degree started. So that's what I was at the beginning, meaning I was, just wide-eyed about journalism and its potential of helping out in situations like this. And then I was rubbish at the beginning. I'll be honest with you. I didn't think I was very effective at all, because I was just scared, frightened of barely even knowing the ABCs of journalism, and started to kind of report out a professional story. So there was fear at the beginning, and then just an interrogation of journalism throughout it, because I'd never done it before. I wanted to actually see if it worked. And by the end of the podcast, I think it's I'm not sure where I land. I begin the narration of the series by saying this is my first and last, or probably last story as a journalist. So that's kind of where I begin. As I say, begin hopeful and end in handing in my resignation.
Yeah.
Is it your last story?
I don't know. I don't know.
No, this is just the beginning, no? But it kind of makes me think of a quote that you put on Instagram, Clarice, because you wrote, "My experience of being harmed by systems, strangers, but also those I love, and having harmed and learned in return, taught me to hold multiple truths, yet to see my own clearer." What did you want to say with that?
Let me think. Can I respond to what he said first,
and then
I'll
keep
get
this
to
in the
that?
back of your mind, and we go back to that.
Because I did listen to the podcast, and I thought it was
just you and I in this room, Clarice. Just you and I in this room.
And I thought it was interesting that this was your student journalism project, that you actually had to decide to study journalism in order to tackle this issue when there's like a whole media apparatus within the country itself, and that no one thought to think, hey, maybe we should try to look into who sent this letter that caused so much policy that in fact affected so many different communities in a negative way. And it reminded me a lot about, I think it's not exceptional. It has happened here as well. We had someone working in the municipality, a Dutch Moroccan woman, Sadia Atalib, and she was working on this de-radicalization project with our former mayor, and it was all very secretive. And then because that was the way they wanted to approach it. But then people at the municipality got suspicious because they were like, what are those Muslims doing behind closed doors, And then there was also a letter, people got suspicious, complaints, started arising, and then she got accused of fraud, and there was this whole court case and everything. And also the media sort of amplified the suspicion. So this is not... I think.
Well, that's the thing. I think just to add to that, like I said somewhere in the podcast, and I don't think that endeared me to a lot of British journalists, but I said somewhere in the podcast that I didn't join journalism because I was particularly impressed by the field. I thought it was a disaster. I thought it was doing a terrible job, and that's kind of why I went in. And so, yes, I agree. I think it's. I do think it's ridiculous to kind of. Feel the need to kind of like diverge your life because you don't think your country's reporting is doing a decent enough job. Like, I do think that's a ridiculous predicament. Equally, though, I think that is important because I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm pretty sure it's like less than 4% or something like that of British reporters are from a minority background, or like something that small. I'm not sure that's the exact number. So there is a need for it. It's true, there is a need for it, and
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad you did. So yeah, just to say that this has happened here as well. Also, when it comes to schools, as you know, in different situations with different communities.
Yeah.
And that for me, my work is always important to look at, what is not being shown or what is not being told. And I think the quote you're talking about was something that I wrote in combination with an article I wrote about restorative justice, because I think the type of journalism that I adhere to is combined with, social justice. And that on the one hand, it's very important to think about the stories that are not being told, think about different ways in which you can tell the story. And the other hand, also to be very critical of, how do you say that? Even your own perspective, and even the perspectives of those that you might be in community with or that you might agree with, to come up with something that's, I guess, more balanced. And that's a very difficult line to walk, particularly when there are so many underrepresented stories, there is so many sort of institutional oppression, etc. So for me, it's been a long journey of trying to figure out my way within the media, within journalism, with my own politics, my own biases, and trying to come up with maybe a new way of doing journalism or a new way of telling stories that's very rooted in this century.
Yeah, because it's also very difficult because the media plays a very big part in, stigmatizing marginalized groups, and all these images and ideas are also being reproduced. So how do you fight that if you're working at a mainstream platform? Because you've worked for NRC, for example, that's like a very big newspaper. Yeah, what's your relationship with mainstream media then if you're trying to, break these kind of structures?
Well, for me, I mean, I love working in media. It's actually something that I've always known I wanted to do, to be a journalist. I was very inspired by Christiane Amanpour, who actually also said, I think when she was covering the war in Bosnia, she said that you can't be neutral in instances of oppression. I don't know what the exact quote was, but that at some point you have to, I wouldn't say pick a side, but at least not be silent and then amplify the side of those who are doing the oppressing. And for me, working in mainstream media, I think maybe you can also answer the question yourself. I've worked for varying media, and it's been difficult because it's such a homogenous sort of institute with a lot of people that are the same and have similar perspectives, and trying to break through that and having your perspective seen as valid, that's a difficult thing. So you always have to prove yourself. I think maybe that's not even only in media, it's anywhere where you're like the anomaly.
Yeah,
so,
because you're saying you can't be neutral in these kind of situations, but a lot of media platforms, they really emphasize on the fact that they're objective.
Yeah, and objectivity is...
But you're saying
that's not
you don't
true.
believe in that.
No, because there is no such thing as objectivity. Every part of you, where you're from, who you are, who your parents are, where you were born, what language you speak, even your preferences, they influence the way you look at the world. And to pretend like that isn't true is dishonest, and it's a disservice to your public and yourself. So I think we should all be more transparent about who we are, what our beliefs are, and what we should strive for should not be this sort of feigned objectivity, but should be fairness. Even though this is my position, these are my politics, maybe if someone is exactly oppositional to my politics, I will still strive to treat them fairly and be aware of what my own biases are.
Yeah.
So I think would be a better aim than to try to be objective, because that just doesn't exist.
But do you then draw a line between activism and journalism, or do you think these things go hand in hand?
I think, for me at least, I think you have varying forms of journalism. You just have the press agencies, and they're like, this happened, and that's it, okay, fine.
The facts, yeah.
Yeah, just the facts. But I think once you're narrating a story, there is no neutrality, there is no, these are just facts. You are contributing something to the story that's being told from your perspective. For me, journalism is more than just copying being like a copy machine of situations that are happening in the world. And so for me, it's about bettering the world and making some sort of change. I typically don't identify as an activist because I don't think being a activist is my job, but I do think I perform activism within what my job is. Because there's a form of advocacy there.
Yeah, by amplifying stories and voices.
Exactly, yeah. And for striving to make society a bit better. And I think actually that a lot more journalists, or that should be the case for journalism in general, instead of just trying to be neutral and objective, because you know, it's an institute. It's one of the most powerful institutes that we have in society. So you have to take that responsibility seriously.
Yeah, I agree. Hamza, do you also agree with these words?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting distinction to make. What is the difference between an activist and journalist? You know, like I've always, in a very flippant way, used to say like, oh, activists are the ones who get things done, and journalists just circle around. That's what I've always said between the two. And I think fair report, like activists are just overt from day one that they are striving towards achieving some kind of change or enacting some kind of change. And I don't think, like, yes, journalism as a profession kind of requires you not to be that overt and ballsy about that from day one. But also, I just think, like, journalists don't operate that way, not all of them. Like, I think a lot of them are actually comfortable reflecting that in their jobs. They don't see it as some kind of great opportunity to change something. They do see it as a good opportunity to tell a story, which they're intrigued by, and, you know, turn up to a situation they're curious by. And I think that's kind of the two different energies with which the two jobs operate. But, you know, I think I've had this question flung at me a few times, like, you know, what's the difference between you and an activist? And I imagined, at least in the context of when those questions came up, that I was supposed to kind of run away from that title or kind of be embarrassed by, like, being labeled as an activist if I was a reporter. And I wasn't sure why. I was like, I don't see the two fields as like as that different, to be honest. Like one can just be one can operate in a way that, like, I think we should be learning from. That, like, oh, here's a person who's actually from day one committed to changing something. And if you really, really reach back into your motivations of becoming a journalist back in the day, before it all kind of got dulled down by professionalism and shaved down, like, you were once motivated to try to change something about the world. Like, it's probably what begun your interest in journalism. It certainly did for me, was not appreciating how the world was working and thinking there's a way I could impact that through writing and reporting. So that's certainly an instinct that we begin with. It just gets dulled down over time. But activist is kind of a purer version of that. Whereas a journalist, I think, has a right to defend themselves and differentiate themselves from activism. Is that, you know, journalists, at least good ones, should always be interested in the conclusion of something or the truth of something, even if it diverges dramatically from your original premise or your original kind of idea or value. And I'm not sure every activist could say that they would stick to that kind of situation and persist with it if it begun to speak to different conclusions or realities. Whereas a journalist, I think that is your job, regardless of what you originally thought the situation was. Wherever the facts lead you, you are compelled to go, and you're almost compelled to be as motivated to discover that. And I think that's where the two can kind of influence each other. You know what I mean? Activists could learn something from that attitude of journalists who operate that way, certainly. And journalists could be inspired by activists and just their absolute determination to try to make a change.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
With the last part, that you always have to be led by the story, so not only your own agenda, and be aware when you're letting that happen. So I'm always, even, you know, when I'm making anything, I'm also questioning myself.
Yeah, because you say your own agenda. Does it also then complicate things if what you're making is also about your own identity? Because, for example, you made this documentary called Ga terug en haal het zwart verzet, or Go back and get back the Black resistance.
Yeah.
Was it then complicated, or does it actually help then to be part of that?
Yeah, I kind of like, I don't know if you know this quote by James Baldwin. I kind of like what he said about being a witness. So because I'm also close to, different communities, different forms of activism, you're also in a position of being a witness and translating that in a certain way to a bigger audience. And to do that, you also have to engage with it. So I don't think that's a bad thing at all. Once there are checks and balances in place. For this documentary, which is, by the way, not necessarily a journalistic documentary, I think it's a mix of things. This is maybe also for people a bit confusing my work. I think I mix different disciplines, so it is a journalistic documentary, but it's also very, how do you say that, poetic, it's also very artistic. There's social criticism in it. For me personally, in my work, I look at what different aspects am I interested in, and do I contain, and how can I use that with the message that I'm sending or the story that I'm telling. So I think it doesn't have to be necessarily either or. That's generally not how I function.
Yeah, it's trying to be multidisciplinary.
Yeah.
So what was the documentary about for people that
So this is my new documentary, Ga terug en haal het, which translates roughly in English to something like Go Back and Fetch It. And it's actually a film that I started 2 years ago that I thought about actually was inspired by the Black Lives Matter uprising. Because, we had all these protests here also in the Netherlands, all around the world, but also in the Netherlands in different cities. And it was just it was amazing, overwhelming, necessary. And then I thought it would be the right time to sort of think about what the stories are in the Netherlands and Suriname, Curaçao, because of the history, the Afro-diasporic people here in the Netherlands. Because when we talk about Black Lives Matter, it's typically centered around this US narrative, as if the resistance that occurs there hadn't occurred here. Mm-hmm. So we also deify these American resistance heroes, like Martin Luther King, which is obviously great, but we have our own stories, we have our own narratives. Yeah. So I thought it would be, if there ever was a time to sort of showcase them, it would be now. Yeah,
it's interesting that you start about timing, because do you think that you could have made a documentary like this before Black Lives Matter?
No, this is something we also address in the film. Also my position, what my position is, but also could I have made this if Black Lives Matter didn't happen? And I don't actually think so, or I think that it would have been a lot harder. So this is the thing, that the main question that is being asked in the documentary also is, is this how change happens? And what do you need in order for things to change? And is Black Lives Matter a trend or not? And what you typically see is that, there's a lot of different sort of resistance movements, uprising, criticisms that are spilling over into the mainstream. And then there's, for a certain amount of time, there's attention for it and people are into it and they post black squares or whatever on Instagram. And then they're like, okay, we're done now. When these things are, they have been happening for centuries. And this is not a moment that happens in a vacuum. There are so many things that have led up to these moments, and so many things that we need to take us further. But I do think that because of the moment that we're living in, that I got the chance to create this, because now it's interesting and it's
relevant.
Yeah, it's relevant
to the bigger audience.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't take the opportunity to do it.
Yeah,
if the opportunity is there, then go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, because this is also something I've heard a lot when I work at media companies. They say, but this is not a relevant subject, or this wouldn't be understood by the general public. So when these things happen, suddenly
there's interest in.
It's not niche anymore. Is that something that you also struggled with then, when you try to make stories that they're not open to it because they think it's too niche, or is that not per se a barrier?
I think that's definitely happened. That I don't think I know. That's definitely happened. That certain stories don't get told because they think there isn't an audience for it. And I think what's been happening the past decades is that journalists or makers or whatever, critics like us, have been cultivating that audience and making it more relevant. So, so that at a certain point, it's not only our jobs to do that, but it becomes like very common.
Yeah, exactly. Also the task of the media to address.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hamza, how was that for you when you wanted to dive in this topic? Like, was there like a lot of interest by the New York Times immediately, or did you have to push for this story to be told?
I was nowhere near the New York Times to begin with. I did have to push for the story to be told, but at first it was just trying to convince local people in England that this was a story deserving of some attention. And that was hard. That was hard because, everyone had lived through so many headlines about the Trojan Horse that when you turn up and kind of try to get them to focus on what you imagined were some overlooked details, they're not turning up to the story with like a fresh mind. They remember that we had 4 national inquiries. They remember that so many reporters from so many national newspapers and broadcasters have already covered this story. So in Britain, it was such a well-trodden and notorious affair that it was difficult for me to get people to take seriously the idea that it was worth revisiting. But then when I came across my colleague in the story, Brian Reed, at the time, he's from this radio show called This American Life, which is a weekly radio show that goes out Fridays here in America. And it's been a long-running series, and he was the managing editor of that. And this other podcast, Zero, came off the back of This American Life. So he was just traveling through my city. I talked to him, knowing, to be honest, that he's an American. And I was just praying that he hadn't heard the story. He wasn't going to come at it from a position of having some kind of a understanding about it. And I could just lay out the beats as I see it, and see if we can kind of understand the significance of who wrote that letter, that question, which I was lucky that Brian immediately did. And within 2 weeks, I was away working on this with an American outfit. And then we'd actually reported about a year and a half worth, or maybe 2 years worth of this story already before the New York Times essentially bought Serial, which is the company that we were working for. And this project shifted over to them. But no, I didn't need longer than 5 minutes with someone from America to convince them on the importance of the story. But yeah, in Britain, it was very, very hard. I think there may be something there, you know what I mean, that America, in some sense, didn't have a stake in the story. And so it's a lot easier for them to just kind of listen to it without being offended at all, or even just being precious about it in any sense. Whereas I think in Britain, obviously, what you're saying is that you've all got something wrong, and that comes with a prang of embarrassment from day one, and also, stubbornness and preciousness. So that was hard to break through.
Yeah, it becomes personal to people almost when you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, when it's not even that personal. It's more about. I mean, obviously, it's also about you as a person, but it's also about how, the culture and the systems and how they function. And I think when you take it less personal, it becomes easier to be like, oh, wait, so this happened. This is not something that we want. What could we have done better? How can we take that with us in the future? And I think because of that, because people think it's about them personally and about whether they are good or bad, when it's like, who cares? I don't care what you do in your personal life. It's about the influence it has and on the greater impact it has on society. Yeah. And things like Islamophobia and certain biases have become so normalized that there isn't any second thought about, hey, should we be doing this? Yeah. And even here also, I mean, what also happened here in Bali when they programmed this event that was where a lot of sort of Islamophobic hate speech came out, which they got a lot of criticism for. This is something it's because you don't think ahead of time, okay, who are we talking to? Who is it about? Who does it harm? Who benefits from this? Who doesn't? And generally, I mean, I think journalists do that generally, but because they're not aware of the biases pertaining to certain communities or certain phobias or whatever, they don't do it when it comes to those topics. And then that results in things like you don't want to have in your institute or within the media.
But I must say, sometimes I'm really surprised because, for example, the child benefit affair or scandal that happened in the Netherlands, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but when the Dutch media outlets put that news out, it was government collapsed over child benefit fraud or something like that.
Yeah.
But in the UK and in the US and in France, the titles were more like Dutch government collapsed over ethnic profiling.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand that because I was like, I trust Le Monde, I trust New York Times, Guardian, it's like high quality newspapers. So why do they mention ethnic profiling and why do the Dutch media not?
It's not about them.
Yeah.
So
but that's weird.
You know,
that's
what Hamza also said, right?
It's so much easier. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and also it's so much easier to delve into the realities of a story that has no bearing on like the reality of your country, but also that extends, I found, not just the attitude to looking into the story to begin with, but also learning from the story. Like Britain remains, I'd say, one of the only countries in the world that like has made no effort to learn anything from the Trojan Horse Affair podcast. Whereas like, you know, Amsterdam, I remember there's people who reached out to me from your country, but from all around the world, looking to learn lessons about Islamophobia and journalism and whatever else that the podcast, you know, has helped them realize, except Britain. So it's a country that continues to, like, so not only are they reluctant to begin with to engage with the subject matter, or even maybe even report on the full truth of it because of you know, some personal involvement with it, or just like whatever. But like then also the lessons, you know what I mean? It's very hard to internalize something when it's about you.
Yeah. Did you have because what you do see is that individual journalists or people that work within media are like, maybe, you know, so you do see that there's things are changing slowly. So I was wondering, with your podcast, did like individuals come to you and were they like, oh, this...
yeah. I mean, editors, individuals, reporters, you name it. My DMs, my private DMs, and that's, I think, what the most infuriating like part is that my private DMs are full of just like messages from senior reporters in all sorts of organizations in Britain, just basically saying like, we messed up. Oh my God, we got this totally wrong, and thank you for this podcast series and blah blah blah. And then the second I DM back to say, well, do you plan to say that publicly and do something about it? It just gets silent.
Yeah, then it's like silence.
It's been seen, but it's just silent. Yeah.
So, but what are they afraid of? You think that they will be slaughtered by the comments? Or?
I mean, here's the thing with the Trojan Horse. I don't know how many stories are kind of come with this range, but the Trojan Horse, it alienates everybody from the BBC and the Guardian all the way up to the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Express, you name it. Like, there's not one publication in Britain that comes out looking decently here. And I think that is what's encouraging, just the wall-to-wall silence on it, and the refusal to engage with the facts of it. Because you have to, I guess, at some point then, if you're going to do that, if you're going to take on the podcast and take on its findings and make some admissions to your own readers, you have to, you know, hold your own hand up. Again, this is not something in which any establishment comes out looking decently. And I think had we split it into those, like, say, if this was a right-wing mistake and right-wing papers and hadn't flamed it, or left-wing or central papers, you would give the other side some ammo. And I think maybe that would have encouraged some kind of like a break of form. But, you know, we speak about the misreporting of the BBC in this series. We speak about how other newspapers got it horribly wrong. And, you know, we don't give them the incentive then to say, can you go report that to your audience, how you messed up in 2014? Because what does that mean? Like, you know, are you going to risk that loss of confidence possibly in your own reporting? And I think that's where it's difficult. Which for me is such a stupid way to look at it, because, you know, you could be mature about this and you could say like, hey, there's a big difference between what you did and what we did. We're daily reporters and we're having to go through the cycle every single day. And sure, we might have made mistakes in it, and we don't have the time or resources to circle back to it. But when someone else has done the work for you, when someone else has gone and returned to the situation, has spent the time and resources to investigate it, then use that material. Like, I think you can very easily take the evidence on and say like, hey, look what else has been found about this case now that someone else has gone to it. We couldn't, you know, look at it with this much, you know, kind of to this extent or this in depth at the time. I'm glad someone has. Let's make the most of it. That doesn't seem to be the attitude. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's very difficult as a journalist to explain why you refuse to engage with evidence and facts, that is your job. You know, again, circling back to the whole activism journalism conversation, that's your job. You're not supposed to get precious about where the facts and evidence leads you. And if that leads you to you saying, I made some mistakes, then admit that. It'll make you a more accurate reporter, I promise you.
Yeah, word up. And in episode 6, you said, as a Muslim first and as a journalist second. That's something that kind of stick with me. What did you mean with that exactly?
I think that was me being honest that like up to that point, or up to a certain point anyway, in the Trojan Horse, I had very, very actively tried to mitigate against that. I had very actively tried to place journalism first as my profession and Muslim kind of standing as my personal self as the back burner, as a thing I'm supposed to try to keep at bay for the sake of the project, or for the sake of the story and its accuracy. And when I realized that was not engendering any of that, it was actually more dishonest for me to kind of like keep myself at bay in the story. I would rather you knew where this was all coming from and who I was, and whatever level of skepticism that that creates in your mind, good. I want people to be skeptically engaging with journalism. I want people to be scrutinizing every fact and detail in a piece of journalism. And if me telling you that I'm a Muslim from Birmingham and here's a story about Muslims from Birmingham, it makes you more wary, good. Slow the podcast down, listen to it a minute at a time, and like go and verify everything I say. Like if you approach that, or if you had that mindset to every piece of journalism, I don't think we'd be struggling as much in the world. So that was me basically declaring that I don't see this as a problem any longer. I see myself and my person as a big, big, big advantage to my reporting. And you know, when I say that line, I think it's just me being honest that like I'll no longer kind of prioritize the facade of this field over the truth.
Yeah. So you say your identity in this story is actually an advantage, but would you then also say that non-Muslim could not make this story?
Plenty of non-Muslims did in 2014. Many, many, many non-Muslim reporters did do the Trojan Horse story in 2014. And you're welcome to engage with their reporting and, you know, see what happened to that story when there wasn't a Muslim involved. Which again is not, you know, that sounds like I'm mocking them or I'm like, you know, being critical of their work, and in a way I am. But like
you can be honest.
I'm also saying that I think it's totally reasonable for you to have got the story wrong if you're not from that area or that background, because you don't know, you have no context to know what is different or what's strange or what's, you know, what's untoward. Like you're coming into a community in a place that you know nothing about. Everything is going to seem
so even if you're like an just advocating for the devil, like even if you're like a Muslim, like Islam expert, studied I don't know, Islam at University of.
My issue with Islam experts is so many have sprouted up since 9/11 that I worry about these credentials, and I worry about what the I don't know what that label means. It's so broad and diffused now that I don't think you can just kind of fall back on that. No, I think I think everyone who has lived, especially a minority kind of existence, like I think it's just fair to say that we just know ourselves better than you know us, regardless of you know, what level of research you might have done or academia you might have attended or like qualifications you might have picked up. You're just never going to know us as well as we do instinctively. And I think that's such an important place to start an investigation on, because, you know, you're trying to figure out what went wrong. But if you don't know what right looks like I don't know how you even begin that journey. And that's my issue with people who take on stories that aren't about them, or like, you know, they have no history to how do you know what looks right and what looks wrong around here? And that's, you know, and amongst that, then I can see the confusion because you don't know. People say that makes you more qualified to be a better reporter because you are now basically turning up, imagining suspicion all around. And you're now basically turning up and saying, well, I don't know anything about how things work around here, so teach me. And that will, in some sense, keep me more fair and accurate because I'm impartial. Yes, but my worry is, who's teaching you then? Like, who are you turning to even begin your work, like developing your perspective about this community and what happened here. Like, I feel like you're not even qualified to make those decisions because you know so little about what's happening. So like, I respect the like kind of sincere intention that I'm here. I don't know anything, but that's great because that means I start from ground zero. No, mate, you still are going to struggle. You're still going to struggle because you're going to have to eventually turn to someone for something. Someone's going to have to speak to you for the story. That decision you're not qualified to make because you don't know about anything about this place.
But what if a non-Muslim journalist at an important publisher reaches out to you? What would you say? Like, if they want to make a story about this, would you like? How could they do it in the right way?
I encourage everyone to do it. I just think like be mindful of your limitations and build a team around a project. I'm not saying like you have to have the premier person involved with the story be kind of like perfectly like relatable, identifiable to the case. I'm just saying make sure as part of your team you have made at least a basic effort to try to factor that in and try to imagine that you might not know the situation and try to imagine like some local knowledge is going to help you. And anyone who thinks that's not going to help, like that level of hubris can only be dangerous.
Yeah. So teamwork makes the dream work, I guess.
Can I also answer it because I think that's absolutely true that indeed teamwork makes the dream work, and you have to have different people in your team. And I know, but I know, currently there's this discussion about who can make what story, and I think that kind of I feel like that's the wrong question to ask in the discussion because it's more about the perspective, not who has permission. No one can give you permission. You want to do something, do it. I mean, it's up to you, whatever. Yeah. But it's about
I got cancelled, but
then that's the risk you take. It's about the perspective, not even because I think there's also a risk when reporting or creations are only identity based. Your identity is not enough to create a story. You have to have, a craft. You have to have theories. You have to have the research. You have to hone your crafts in order to make something. And I think your identity or who you are, where you come from, adds to that.
Yeah.
So,
because sometimes you see that with talk shows, right? It's like about Black Lives Matter, and they just pick this random black person
to go sit there and yes. And I often get, when it's about women or something happens with black people somewhere, and then they call me, and I'm like, no, why should I? What? No.
Yeah.
So you also have that risk that people are like, oh, we just want to check the boxes. When it's a combination of things.
Superficial then.
It's very superficial, and it's not about superficial knowledge or a superficial experience. It's about, sort of all-encompassing perspective, the work, and that's something we should be mindful of as well.
Only about looks. Yeah, I get called with Ramadan every year.
You have what?
With Ramadan every year.
Oh,
you get called. I'm like,
and then they ask you, can you
make Muslim stories? I'm like, okay, my parents are Christians, but sure. You look like one, Apparently
fine.
Looking like a Muslim is enough then. It's like strange. Yeah. But would you then also say that a white person could have not made Zwart Verzet? Like,
I think they couldn't have made it the way I did.
Yeah.
You can make it, but it won't be what I made.
Yeah.
So, and also you should ask yourself, should I be the one to make this right now, in this moment?
And when you make your teams then around a documentary like that, what do you select on?
I think it's really difficult working in a field, and particularly, within media where, or filmmaking, where typically it's very, white-dominated, male-dominated, etc. And I also don't like to select only on identity. So, like I said, but it does play a part. So, of course, I look at, okay, so who's doing the work in cinematography that has the perspective that I need and the skills that I need? Who's doing the work in editing, etc. And often, you can find the people with. You can find all the people with sort of all the perspectives that you want, or coming from the communities that you want, or having the engagement with the communities that you want, because it's a white-dominated industry. But then it's important that you can talk about it, and that the team sort of it's a holistic thing. So it's not about individuals, so that you sort of cover each other where the other doesn't have the reach or the perspective or the experience. And that's kind of what happened when I brought together my team. And I looked at what is the story that I want to tell, what kind of people and perspectives and experience do I need for that, and who can I how can I put this together? But I do think it's a lack that when it comes to the people that have the most say or power or are in certain positions to create things, that the higher up you go, the more homogenous it gets.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and that's a problem. Yeah, okay. I just saw that we have 5 more minutes, so I would actually like to, go to the audience and see if there is questions. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Is there somebody that wants to ask Clarice or Hamza something? Don't be shy. No questions? Wow, this disappoints me, but it's fine. Okay.
There's a question there. You said give it some
Oh,
time.
sorry,
You
I
have to
didn't see
think
you.
about it. Let it marinate.
Oh, wow, you have a very sharp eye because I didn't see you.
Hi, I'm Christine. Thank you for your interesting talk so far. Do you ever take into account I put it a little bit negatively, but the short attention span of your viewers sometimes, because you want to tell them a message or tell them an opinion, and you want to grab their attention, and is that something that you take into account?
Yes. I think so. I think that what you've seen, particularly with the existence of social media, that's maybe also what you're referring to, that people don't have the attention span anymore to take in difficult information. So on the one hand, yes. So you think about creating things that are shorter, that go online, that are easier, etc. Also, when making this documentary, I always thought about the levels of information that people had and tried to balance it. And on the other hand, I'm also like, well, it's also your role. You also have the function to educate your audience. So even if they don't understand it now or have the attention for it, they might come back to it later. So I think you also have to I try to balance that sort of fine line.
Make difficult things, or to make
things that are maybe complicated more accessible, but not so accessible that they're like one-dimensional. And also, you don't want to treat your audience like they're children, unless you're creating for children, then you should really do that. But
some stories are not easy. Hamza, is that also the reason why you chose for the format of a podcast? Because
yes and no.
Did you think people wouldn't read maybe all these difficult topics?
Honestly, I think about the format of the podcast not in the sense of celebrating the audience that it did bring to the story, because it did. This was a big podcast and millions of downloads, and I was very appreciative of that. I don't necessarily know it was the best medium to tell the story in for the people in Birmingham, in East Birmingham. I'm from Birmingham, and I know that podcast is not a big thing where I'm from. Like, I had listened to 2 podcasts before I made one, and that was, S-Town and Zero Season 1, and then that was it. I made one. So, knowing that, it would be difficult for me to explain the motivation of going to podcasts, because I'm believing, especially more now, in doing the story in the medium that the people who the story is about, they engage with. So however they receive the information, don't get precious about it. If they prefer to pick things up from TikTok, then make a TikTok about what you just done. I don't care. And this is a story which is bizarre, because I don't know how many million. I think we crossed 30 or 40 million or something downloads. But that's a reflection of how many people around the world heard it. I still wouldn't be able to tell you, in East Birmingham, how many in particular heard it. And that's something that I should have been mindful for. And to your comment about audience and engagement and capturing attention, I think that's something to remember, is who are you trying to catch, and how do they receive their stuff. But there's, for me, a bigger worry is not necessarily even capturing people's attention. You could give me 10 seconds, you can give me 10 minutes. I don't really care about that. The bit which is really, really troubling me is that there's just a basic illiteracy about journalism. And that is more worrying than how long I get you to engage in my reporting. Because I find, and I don't think this is universal all around the world, I don't know what the situation is in where you guys are, but in the countries where I operate, people would not be able to distinguish between a 4.5-year investigative a series that has been deeply reported and fact-checked and lawyered, and we had a whole team of people, just like every side that I made in the podcast was like, had to be okayed with the New York Times and checked and made sure that I was an authentic site, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically the most robust piece of journalism you can imagine, because you have a whole team, a division that's just sweeping up behind you, making sure every detail is accurate. People don't know the difference between that and a opinion column, you know, and that is more worrying for me than how long I had their attention for, because they could hear an 8-hour podcast, which a lot of people did, meaning I managed to capture your attention because you've heard 8 hours of a series. But then they'll also read a opinion column the day after, and imagine the two
on
are
Facebook.
the same. Yeah, imagine the two are the same. And so, you know, I don't really care how long it took you to get to each piece. I do worry about what you think they are that you're engaging with. And I think like the audience capture and trying to get like, you know, the audience's attention, for me at the moment anyway, takes the back seat. I just want you to, when you are paying attention, to know what you're paying attention to. And, you know, that might be something to build from.
Yeah.
And, you know, you also can't control everything. So for me, what I also try to do is make you feel something. And because that is often, people don't remember the details, but they'll remember how they felt about it and what it did with them. And if I can accomplish that, you know, with all of the things that we're talking about and all of the different sort of perspectives and whatever, that's what it's about, like connecting to a certain human experience.
Yeah.
And if you can accomplish that, then I think, you know, your job is done.
Yeah, that's amazingly put. And unfortunately, the panel is also done because we're running out of time. Hamza, thank you again so much for waking up early. I also kind of hate that. I'm not a morning person, so I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And Clarice, also thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you for moderating.
You're welcome. Then the only thing that lasts is to ask the audience to give you a big applause. Okay, thank you so much for being here. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I think you can have a drink somewhere or still discuss with other people or with Clarice if you're hanging here. And have a good one.
Thank you for coming.